Population, Pensions and Endogenous Economic Growth by Burkhard Heer and Andreas Irman, published in the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control 2014. Hello and welcome to this presentation of our results from our JDC article. In the next 10-15 minutes, I will present to you in a nutshell the intuition, the ideas, the motivation and the results of our study. Before I go into greater specific detail of the model and the methods and our results here, so you can capture the main essence of what we did in the next 5 to 10 minutes. And the starting point of our study of our research question here is the demographic transition in the economies, that we all get older in the Western industrialized country, but not also only in the West, but also, for example, in China. So let me present to you this transition, which is captured here by the development of the old age dependency ratios. The old age dependency ratio is defined as the ratio of the number of 66-year-olds and older relative to the number of 20-year to 65-year-old. And this is a good proxy for the numbers of retirees relative to workers. So we of course have some workers who still work at age 67 or 68 or 70, and we have some workers at age 60, well, who think about early retirement. But as a crude measure of the number of retirees relative to workers, this is a good proxy. And as you can see in the United States, for example, it increases from about 25% to 45% between 2000 and 2050, meaning that in the year 2000, about 4 workers financed the pension of 1 retiree. And in 2050, this ratio goes down to basically 2 workers finance 1 retiree. And the situation is much more bleak in other countries, for example, in Japan, Italy, or Germany, and also to some extent in China. Now, related to this problem of demographic transition, that we have fewer people to finance the pensions of the old agents, there are 2 main issues in the literature and also in the policy-related issue that economists consider. So let me go to the whiteboard to show you these 2 issues. So first of all, we observe that in many countries, public pension policies are no longer sustainable. So let me remind you how public pensions, pay-as-you-go pension system work. Current workers, they pay contributions into the pension system to the Social Security Authority, and the Social Security passes it on to the retirees. Now, if the number of workers shrinks relative to the numbers of recipients, the retirees, this may become unsustainable. And there's a paper by me, Vito Polito, and Mike Wiggins in the JDC, which estimates that, well, in some countries like Italy, France, Germany, and Spain, in continental Europe, pensions are no longer sustainable after the years 2030, 2035. The reason is, even if we maximize contributions from the workers by imposing contributions rate of 20, 30, 40%, 50%, well, somewhere there's a maximum we can get out of Social Security contributions, out of labor income taxes, which is associated with the maximum of the Laffer curve. And this maximum of Social Security contributions is insufficient to pay the public pensions that we promised to the future retirees in the year 2030 or 2035. Now, this is not the situation in the United States or Great Britain. There it's not as bleak. So these public pension systems are sustainable because of the demographic transition, which is more favorable, and because pensions are much lower in these countries. So we have, for example, pension replacement rates in the United States of 35%, meaning that on average, pensions are about 35% of gross wage income in the economy. And in Europe, it's 70, 80, or sometimes even higher, a higher replacement rate. The second main result here in this literature is that the optimal level of public pay-as-you-go pensions should be smaller. So, famous paper here by Kitao in the Review of Economic Dynamics. He studies a couple of pension reforms, whether we should keep pensions constant or whether we should keep contributions rate constant so that pensions fall, or whether we should increase retirement age. And he finds that smaller pensions are increased welfare. And this is also borne out by results by my own. So I did calculations on the optimal pension amount of pensions, and I find that, well, optimal replacement rates of pensions are around 15 to 20% for the United States, meaning that pensions should only be 15% of gross wage income in the United States, and it should even decline in the process of the demographic transition to a smaller number. Now, all these studies here, and basically all studies in this area of public pensions and demographic transition, they take productivity growth as exogenous, as constant. So usually these studies assume something like 2% of productivity growth in the United States. And productivity growth, of course, is an important component if you compare private savings for old age or public pensions for old age. Now, the return from private savings is basically the return which you get in the capital market, so the real return on, let's say, stocks and bonds. And when you invest in the public pay-as-you-go pension system, you pay your contributions today for the retirees. And when you retire, for example, when I retire in 10 years, well, future worker will pay my pension, and the return from this depends on, well, how many workers will there be in the future to pay my pensions, so which is captured by the old age dependency ratio, and by productivity growth. So their wages in 10, 20 years will be higher than wages today, and therefore I will get a higher pension because then contributions will also increase. Now, when you compare the returns from these two investments, usually the one in private capital markets is higher. The real return in capital markets is higher than the return from the public pay-as-you-go pensions, and therefore we tend to we rely to a higher extent on private savings than on public pay-as-you-go pension system. Of course, we also have to weigh the risk. With private savings, we have the capital market risk, and with public pensions, we have the demographic risk. Now, in all these studies, however, the productivity growth is taken to be exogenous, and we think that this is too simple, too simplistic. We need to take into account the effect of aging on growth. Why is this the case? Let me go back into the slides to argue our motivation here. Well, there are a bunch of channels how a decline in the labor force can affect growth. One, for example, is that the market for capital goods, for innovative goods, shrinks, becomes smaller. So young people, for example, they use technological goods like smartphones, and all people, to use a cliche, they play bingo. They consume goods where we can observe little technological progress. So, for example, healthcare services in old age. There's little technological progress, for example, in taking care of an older person. Now, therefore, we would expect that technological progress in the consumption goods sector is higher when we have a young population, and it's low when we have an old population. Also, the younger population is more innovative. So if you look at the managers, the founders of startups, they're usually people at age 25, 30, or sometimes even younger, and hardly any people at age 60. Now, these two effects, well, would imply that the economic growth rate goes down with the demographic transition over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But there's also an effect that counteracts this negative effect, which is positive. And this is an incentive effect on investments. Firms have an incentive to invest in labor-saving technology when there's little labor. You need to invest into robots, into artificial intelligence in order to replace labor, which becomes scarcer and scarcer and therefore more expensive. Now, when we implement this mechanism in our model, it is based upon the theoretical paper by Helwig and Irman in JET. And the reason to focus on this growth enhancing effect of a decline in labor force also is supported by empirical evidence. So what we find is that when the labor force declines, there's an increase in productivity growth. So there's, for example, a paper by Cutler, Puterba, Scheiner, and Summers, and some other literature that we have listed in the paper, for example, Romer, among others. There's also a theoretical argument here. So there's the famous AK growth literature, where growth rate increases with higher capital intensity, capital per labor. And what you find is typically in these models that the capital intensity increases. So let me go back to the whiteboard to make this argument. So what we have is that labor declines. Sorry for this. Labor declines during demographic transition. So let's say L goes down, which is effective labor, number of people times the productivity efficiency. And we have capital stock. Now what's happening to capital stock? If we have fewer workers, we have less production, smaller income, and therefore savings goes down. Savings is equal to investment, therefore our capital stock goes down. But the decline in the capital stock is smaller than the percentage decline in labor. The reason is simple. When we get older, well, we also have to save more, for example, for old age, for times when we cannot work, to pay for our consumption during retirement. So the fall in capital, K, is smaller than the fall in labor. And therefore, our capital intensity, K over L, goes up. And in this AK growth literature, this means that also our growth rate goes up. Now we rely on a different mechanism. We rely on the effect that firms observe we have fewer workers, there's labor shortage. So what we do? We develop robots, we develop artificial intelligence so that they can replace workers. And this incentive goes up during the demographic transition, and we estimate what is the effect on economic growth. Let me summarize our results from this JDC article. Importantly, we find that the growth rate will increase as a consequence of the demographic transition of the decline in labor force. It will increase from 1.74% during the 90s to 2.41% by 2100. And already in 2050, it will be close to 2.4%. Our second main result, the public pension system, its design and possible reforms of the public pension system will have a quantitative effect on the economic growth rate. So let's look at three prominent reform proposals that we will study in our paper. The first one is we keep the pension constant with respect to wages. So as a consequence, if we have more retirees and fewer workers, this means that we have to raise the contribution rate. In this case, our growth rate is equal to 2.41% in the long run. If we keep contributions constant and assume a balanced budget of the Social Security Authority, this means that pensions have to decline. And in this case, growth rate increases to 2.8%. So here we have a huge effect of 0.4 percentage points on the economic growth rate. And the reason, of course, is that the main distortionary effects of the public pay-as-you-go pension system stems from its distortion of the labor supply. The contribution rate acts like a tax on labor supply, on wage income, and therefore with higher contributions we reduce our labor supply, which will result in a lower growth rate in our model. And if we keep the contribution rate constant, well, the distortionary effect is smaller than in the case with constant pensions, or also in the case of an increase in retirement age, where we, however, leave the pension replacement rate constant. In this case, in our scenario 3, the growth rate also goes up to 2.4%, so that here we find that the constant contribution rate is the most beneficial policy option with respect to economic growth. Now let me relate our results to this literature here that I mentioned to you, the one that points out that public pension systems are unsustainable in Europe, in continental Europe, in Italy, France, Germany, and Spain, and then after 2030 everything is over. And with regard to optimal public pay-as-you-go pension system, which assumes a constant economic growth rate of 2%, and that therefore, as a consequence, public pensions should be small with a replacement rate of something like 15–20%. Well, with regard to these conclusions, we make a we derive a qualifying result here. We are a little bit more optimistic about the future, and these results here are dampened by our results, by our finding that the growth rate will go up during the demographic transition. Show you where you can download the paper. Well, you can always send me an email, burkhard.herr@wiwi.uni-augsburg.de, and I can send you the preprint or the slides of this talk, but you can also go to my homepage and download the link, download the preprint. So you find the address of my homepage here in the upper menu bar here in the address line, and just scroll down, and here in the year 2014, for example, you find the PDF with the preprint from our Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control article by Andreas Ehrman and me in the year 2014. As promised, I will go into the details of our model, of our study in the following. So we look at a typical Auerbach-Kotlikoff model. Agents' lifetime is stochastic. They live a maximum of 70 years, starting age 20, 21. They do not become older than 90 years old, and we have annual periods. So period length is equal to years. They just maximize expected lifetime utility with respect to consumption and leisure. And we also have two productivity types: college students and graduate students. So the college students, their productivity, their wage premium is 150% vis-a-vis the wage of the high school graduates. And productivity is also age dependent. So as observed empirically, the age productivity profile is hump-shaped, so that productivity peaks at around age 51, 52 as estimated by Hansen. Now this is a standard setup, and I will not go into the details, but if you're interested, you find much more on my YouTube channel. So there are many videos on the Auerbach-Kotlikoff model, both the setup of the model and its computation with computer languages like Python, Julia, MATLAB, or Gauss, and you will find the code and everything there. So please feel encouraged to visit my YouTube channel. Now, what's special and what you do not find elsewhere, and to the best of my knowledge, you will just find in the paper by Andreas and me, that's the production sector. And we have adapted it to the production sector of Helwig and Ehrman, published in JET in 2001. So we have two goods, final goods and intermediate goods. And what's special is that the intermediate goods firms have an incentive to invest in labor-saving technology. And in this framework, we analyze three different scenarios of the US pension system. One is where we keep the pensions constant with respect to wages, and the contribution rates adjust, so it has to go up during the demographic transition. Second scenario, where we keep the contribution rates to the pension system constant, so that the replacement rate of pensions has to decline. And third, we look at a longer working life, 50 years instead of 45 years. And in this case, we also keep pensions constant relative to wages. Now let me step into the modeling of production here. In the final goods sector, we just produce output, which is our consumption investment good here, with the help of capital K and with intermediate goods. And our intermediate goods, well, they are produced in, of course, the intermediate goods sector. Firms in this sector maximize profits, which is production Y minus interest rates cost, R times K of capital, minus depreciation of capital, delta times KT, minus the expenses of the intermediate goods. And the expenditures for the intermediate goods are the price of the intermediate goods, P, times the amount of good X. And firms maximize profits, so we have standard first order conditions, and in equilibrium profits are zero. Now the new thing here is the intermediate goods sector. We have an endogenous number of intermediate goods firms, and each one produces a maximum of one good, and its production is equal to A times L, where A is the firm individual productivity level times labor demand LD. Now this firm's labor productivity, lowercase a, depends on, well, knowledge in the economy, of the productivity in the economy in the previous period. So this older knowledge, it becomes common knowledge with a lag of one period. And then they invest into labor saving tech research and development, which produces a productivity growth rate of Q. And in order to achieve Q, they have to invest I of Q as described by function 4. And we just assume that the nu is larger than 1, which will result in a concave profit function, so that the first and second order conditions of profit maximization are nicely. And this is also borne out by empirical evidence that we use to estimate mu, the elasticity of investment with respect to productivity growth Q. Now firms, the individual firms here in this sector maximize their individual profits, which are their sales, P times X, minus the wage cost, W times L, minus the investment cost. And investment has to be pre-financed. So at the beginning of periods, they have to find a financial intermediary and get a loan at the amount of I in order to finance productivity growth Q. And at the end of the period, the productivity growth bears out, their labor savings investment bears out. Productivity goes up by the factor Q, and they have to repay the loan 1 plus R times I. So what we observe here is that the opportunity cost of labor are wages, and the opportunity cost of investment into labor saving technology is R1 plus the interest rate R. And in the beginning, I have explained to you why during the demographic transition, W will go up, scarcer labor will get higher wages, and the interest rate will go down. So we observe, for example, right now, we have real interest rate of close to 0. We have secular stagnation. And one explanation for this, of course, are demographics, and that the capital intensity will go up, and as a consequence, interest rates will go down. And this factor price movement will result in a change of the labor savings investment, of the research and development investment of the intermediate goods firms. In equilibrium, the number of firms adjusts so that profits are equal to zero. So that's very nicely here. So in the AK model or in other endogenous growth model, you have profits here. This is a competitive equilibrium with zero profits and still resulting in endogenous growth. So very nice setup here on Martin Helwig and Andreas Oehlen. All firms are equal and therefore all are identical. Therefore, they invest the same amount in labor-saving technology, and as a consequence, the individual productivity growth rate is the same, and therefore it is also equal to the average or aggregate productivity 80. And next period, in period T plus 1, the individual knowledge becomes common knowledge, and firms again use the knowledge of the previous period to decide upon the firm-specific investment in research and development in labor-saving technological progress. That describes the firm sector, and that's the heart of our model, the new element in this demographic analysis of the demographic transition in the Auerbach-Kotlikoff model. Now let me show you the results, the transition in the benchmark model, where we have constant pensions relative to wages. What are the dynamics? The dynamics, well, they are computed with the help of standard computational methods. You can find them in my book with Alfred Mausner, Dynamic General Equilibrium Model here. So allow me to show you this book here. Some advertising here. So that's the book where you can find all the computational methods and a description how you compute Auerbach-Kotlikoff models and a description of the setup of the main Auerbach-Kotlikoff model. Now in the upper left panel, we have the share of working age population. Next, we have to the right, we have capital intensity, K over L, effective labor, and the growth rate Q of the firms, the innovation rate Q. As we can observe, the share of working age population declines during demographic transition, so from 86% during 1940 to about 74% today, and so expected to decline to something like 68% in the very long run by 2200. And as a consequence, effective labor also declines in close proportion to the decline in the working age population. We find that capital intensity goes up, so even though labor declines, total production declines, savings decline, labor declines to a larger extent than savings, and therefore the capital intensity, the capital stock per effective labor goes up, and as a consequence here of the decline in effective labor, we also have an increase in the growth rate, because with the higher capital intensity, with increasing capital intensity, well, our wages go up and our interest rates decline. And both factors here, the increase in wages, the decline in interest rates, increases incentives for the firms to invest in labor-saving technological progress, to invest in research and development, into robots, into artificial intelligence. This translates into an increase in the output growth rate from about 1.7 during the 90s up to 2.4% in the long run. And you can see some humps here, and they reflect the humps in the projection of the demographics by the United Nations during these years. Now, in order to finance the higher number of retirees, the increase in pensions, well, Social Security has to increase Social Security contribution rate from 7 to something like 15%. So it has to double over the next 50 to 100 years. Now, our first result here clearly the productivity growth increases during the demographic transition. Quantitative effect is significant. It increases from 1.7% during the 90s to 2.4% by 2100. Now remember the three pension reform proposals: constant pension replacement rate. Here we look at here we have the net replacement rate. So this is a replacement rate of pensions relative to net wages, which is 50%. The gross replacement rate of pensions to gross wages is 35%, corresponding to this number. So we have kept the net replacement rate constant at 50% in the first case. In the second case, we have kept the social security contribution rate constant to 8%, the level prevailing in 2010. And in the third case, we have increased the retirement age to 70, increasing working life from 45 to 50 years. And this is the result on our endogenous variables. So let me first direct your attention to the bottom diagrams. On the left-hand side, we have the social security contribution rate, and on the right-hand side, we have the pension replacement rate. So in scenarios 1 and 3, the pension replacement rate is kept constant. In scenario 2, the social security rate is kept constant at approximately 7% as prevailing in 2010. Now for scenarios 1 and 3, the contribution rate has to increase to finance pensions. And in the case of an increase in retirement age, well, we implemented the increase in retirement as follows. In 2010, we tell people who start their working life, well, when you will retire, you have to work 50 years rather than 45 years. That's why the effect of an increase in retirement age is only effective after the year 2055. And then, as you can see, a higher number of households of workers will manifest itself. So after 5 years, after a transition period of 5 years, workers up to age 70, all workers age 65 through 70 will work, and this results in a drop of the social security contribution rate relative to the case where retirement age remains fixed at age 65. In the scenario 2, the pension replacement rate has to decline from 50% to 25%, almost half in the long run here, when we keep the contribution rate constant. So pensions decline by 50% due to the demographic transition if we freeze the contribution rate. Now, what's the effect on capital intensity and effective labor? First, look at effective labor, the upper right panel here. And as you can see in the benchmark case, which is the solid case, we have the constant pensions. In the second case, when we increase retirement age, as you can see, well, then effective labor starts to increase in year 2055 until the year 2060 and is highest compared to the other two scenarios. And if we keep the contribution rate constant to the year 2000, to the value prevailing in the year 2010, well, then people have higher incentive to supply labor because the tax on labor income, the social security tax, is lower. And this increases labor supply from 0.23 to 0.24, so by 5% in the long run. This is a disincentive effect of higher contributions rate to finance larger amounts of pensions due to demographic transition. What is the effect on the growth rate Q here? Well, you can see that the scenarios 1 and 3 are basically the same here in the long run. Of course, the transition period, we have some divergent effects, but scenarios 1 and 3, starting in the year 2100 or 2080, 2080 are pretty much the same. But what's remarkable is that the growth rate is 0.4 percentage points higher in the case of a constant contribution rate. So the policy reform, the public policy reform, has a large effect here on the economic growth rate, and we find that our results 2 and 3, that the long-run change in productivity growth is largest in the case of a pension reform that keeps the contribution rate constant. And we have also analyzed the welfare, and there we looked at generational welfare, so we have to take into account whether the welfare of the generation born in 2010, 2020, and so on might diverge. And we find that the reform proposal 2, with a constant contribution rate, is also the most preferable one with respect to welfare. In fact, all those agents born after 1986, and this must be most of our viewers here, would benefit from a pension reform which keeps contribution rates constant rather than keeping pensions constant or increase the retirement age to 70. So let me summarize what Andreas and I have found in this JDC article. We found that the growth rate depends upon demographics. The effect is not negligible. So depending on the pension reform, it may be something between 0.5 and 0.9 percentage points, which is huge in terms of the viability, sustainability of public pension system. The most favorable, both in terms of growth and in terms of welfare, is a reform that keeps contribution rates constant or small and lets pension decline. So again, we have that public pay-as-you-go pensions are probably too high in the United States and in particular elsewhere in continental Europe. With these results, we can be a little bit less pessimistic about the prospects of the sustainability of public pension systems. Well, even with a little bit more growth in continental Europe, we are at the edge of sustainability and we need to act now and dramatically. In the United States and in Great Britain, we can be a little bit more relaxed. We also need to put these results a little bit into perspective. So we have made some simplifications in our model. A recent paper by Nishiyama and Smetters in the QJE 2007 pointed to the fact that two assumptions are also very sensitive. So we have not studied whether we have annuity markets. So in our model, annuity markets are missing. And we have concentrated on a closed economy. Consider the United States as a closed economy, but in an open economy, results may be different. So with these two qualifying remarks, nevertheless, our results emphasize that we should be careful interpreting the results from other dynamic general equilibrium, large-scale OLG models, overlapping generations model studies that keep the productivity growth rate constant. We find that demographic transition makes the public pay-as-you-go pension system a little bit more favorable by increasing its return basically stemming from population growth or demographics, so how many workers finance one retiree, and from productivity growth because future workers will have higher wages. And it's the second component where we think we should be a little bit more optimistic, even though we're economists, we come from the dismal science here from economics, there we should be a little bit more optimistic. So this raises the attractiveness of public pay-as-you-go pension system vis-a-vis private savings, where the return is the return, of course, in the capital markets. But nevertheless, the main important component of savings for old age security it's still optimal to basically save for old age yourself and provide private savings to ensure against the risk of a long life. And I hope you enjoyed this paper. Please send me an email if you have comments, questions, if you would like to find out more about the Auerbach-Kotlikoff model and about computer code, where to look at, and I will be happy to help you.